Right now, somewhere in your home, a small plastic thermostat on the wall quietly keeps you warm while you barely notice it. For hundreds of thousands of years, every human who came before you had to fight for the warmth that now happens automatically. Imagine an Ice Age winter so brutal that the cold itself becomes a predator, with no central heating, electricity, insulated walls, or glass windows. Ancient humans had only frozen ground, animal skins, fire, and the intelligence inside their own minds. And instead of simply surviving those winters, they learned how to defeat them by building shelters, clothing, ventilation, fuel systems, and food stores. This is the story of how Ice Age humans stayed warm and turned a frozen world into a place they could actually live. The comfort surrounding you today was not invented all at once, but inherited through thousands of generations of human problem-solving. Ancient people looked at a frozen landscape and realized that simply enduring the cold wasn't enough. They had to outsmart it. They were not the primitive cave dwellers usually shown in cartoons, but planners, builders, and problem solvers working with bone, hide, earth, stone, grass, and fire. Without thermometers, blueprints, textbooks, or modern science, they discovered principles that still make sense thousands of years later. But before we examine their incredible shelters, we need to understand the enemy they were fighting: the cold. Imagine standing on the Eurasian steppe roughly 25,000 years ago with temperatures around -40 degrees. The landscape stretches almost endlessly in every direction, with few trees, almost no natural shelter, and relentless wind. At those temperatures, exposed skin becomes dangerous quickly, while moisture freezes and the body constantly loses heat. The wind makes everything worse by accelerating heat loss, leaving a person with nowhere to hide from the freezing environment. There is no warm building, car, emergency shelter, or heating system nearby, only snow, grass, darkness, and an environment indifferent to survival. A modern person suddenly placed into that world would be in serious danger, because the body can only produce heat so quickly. If the body continuously loses more heat than it can replace, survival becomes an unforgiving equation. Yet Ice Age humans didn't merely survive one winter. They lived through generations while raising children, caring for elders, hunting, traveling, creating art, and building communities. So how did they do it? The answer begins underground, where archaeologists discovered carefully constructed pits and depressions at ancient settlements across Russia and Eastern Europe. Some of these pits were several feet deep, and their depth mattered because the ground itself can act as a thermal buffer. Surface temperatures can change dramatically with the seasons, while deeper underground temperatures remain much more stable. Ancient humans didn't know modern equations for thermal conductivity or soil temperature, but they could observe, experiment, remember, and teach what worked. A parent could teach a child where to dig, a hunter could teach another hunter what worked, and a builder could demonstrate exactly where walls belonged. Over thousands of years, these small observations could become an entire survival system passed down through memory instead of books. They didn't try to overpower the cold directly. They used the environment itself as part of their defense. The familiar image of an Ice Age human living permanently inside a cave is misleading because caves were not available everywhere. Even when caves existed, they could be damp, flood, trap smoke, and attract dangerous animals, such as cave bears and cave lions. Instead of relying on natural shelters, humans learned to build their own protected environments. Across Russia, Ukraine, and Central Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberately constructed Ice Age homes rather than random piles of materials. These structures were designed, assembled, repaired, and adapted with different materials chosen for specific purposes. One of the most fascinating examples comes from Mammoth-Bone settlements in Eastern Europe. At sites like Mizurek and Kostenki, researchers discovered structures constructed from enormous quantities of mammoth bone. Heavy mammoth skulls could serve as foundation elements, while long bones and tusks formed structural supports, and jawbones strengthened the walls. The entire framework could then be covered with hides and insulating materials to create a protected interior. People living in a landscape with scarce trees had effectively turned the remains of enormous animals into building materials. The resulting structures could resist wind, support a roof, and create a warm interior space. But the design wasn't only about strength, it was about controlling heat. A shelter slows heat loss through its walls, protects against wind and snow, and uses an interior fire to add warmth. Different materials could perform different jobs within the same shelter. Animal hide could create a protective surface, while grass, moss, and other plant materials provided insulation. Outer coverings could reduce wind penetration and protect the structure from wind and snow and moisture. Different materials with different functions became one integrated thermal system. Modern buildings use foam, fiberglass, synthetic membranes, and weather-resistant coverings to solve essentially the same problem. The basic goal remains unchanged: keep heat inside, keep wind outside, control moisture, and protect the people living within the structure. But this creates another danger that ancient builders had to solve: moisture. Every person inside a shelter releases water vapor through breathing, while cooking, melting snow, and burning fires add even more moisture. If that moisture cannot escape, it can condense on cold surfaces and eventually freeze. Over time, ice can accumulate inside walls and coverings, making materials damp, reducing insulation, adding weight, and damaging the structure. Poor air circulation could also make the interior unhealthy, so an effective shelter needed ventilation as well as insulation. Ancient shelters show evidence of openings positioned at different heights to control the movement of air. Lower openings could allow cooler air to enter, while higher openings allowed warmer, moisture-rich air to escape. As warm air rises, it naturally creates circulation without electric fans, motors, or complicated machinery. Fresh air enters through lower openings, while warm, damp air leaves through higher ones, allowing the shelter to breathe. Fire stood at the center of this entire system, providing warmth, cooking, lighting, protection, tool production, food preparation, and social life. A central hearth could heat the shelter, while smaller working areas served specific functions around the living space. One area could be used for cooking, while another was dedicated to tool-making and repair. The warmest and most protected areas could be reserved for sleeping and resting. Children, infants, and older members of the group could be placed closest to the fire because they needed warmth the most. The shelter, therefore, wasn't merely keeping everyone alive, it was organized around the needs of the people inside it. That required planning, cooperation, and an early form of social engineering. But even the best shelter was useless without fuel. The Ice Age steppe was not covered with endless forests, and in many regions wood was scarce. Humans therefore learned to use alternative fuels, such as dried animal dung and bones containing valuable fat and marrow. Different fuels burned differently, so people had to understand which materials ignited easily, which burned longer, and which produced more heat. Fuel had to be collected, prepared, stored, and rationed, rather than simply gathered whenever needed. This meant winter survival began months before winter actually arrived. Building a shelter required moving large bones, preparing hides, collecting insulation, assembling the structure, storing fuel, and preserving food. Trying to complete all of that after heavy snow arrived would have been extremely difficult. Preparation, therefore, had to happen during the warmer months. Imagine standing outside in summer, looking across green grass, while knowing that the same landscape would soon become frozen and dangerous. Instead of simply enjoying the warm season, people spent it preparing for the winter months ahead. They were not merely reacting to weather, they were planning for the future. Food storage was another part of the same strategy. Frozen ground could function as natural refrigeration, allowing meat to remain preserved in cold conditions. Underground pits and storage areas could protect food supplies throughout the winter. The winter shelter was therefore not just a house, but one part of a larger network involving shelter, fuel, food, clothing, ventilation, and fire. Every part of the system depended on the others, and eventually there was another problem: leaving the shelter. Even the best house becomes useless if a person freezes immediately after stepping outside. This is where clothing became one of humanity's greatest survival technologies. Bone needles found at Ice Age sites reveal that people could create fitted garments rather than simply wrapping themselves in loose animal hides. A needle meant stitching, and stitching allowed clothing to be shaped closely around the body. An inner insulating layer could trap warm air, while an outer layer protected against wind, snow, and moisture. Openings around the wrists, neck, and ankles could also be carefully controlled to reduce heat loss. Different animal materials could be selected for different purposes, with fine fur providing insulation and tougher hides protecting against the elements. The basic strategy was almost identical to modern cold weather clothing: trap warm air, slow heat loss, block wind, and manage moisture. Modern expedition clothing uses advanced synthetic fabrics, while Ice Age humans used animal products, but the underlying physics remained the same. Their clothing also required constant maintenance because hides, seams, insulation, and tools could wear out. Survival was therefore not one brilliant invention, but thousands of small decisions repeated every day. People had to build, inspect, repair, improve, and repeat those actions throughout the winter. But eventually, an even stranger question appears. How did they keep their minds alive during the long winter nights? Imagine spending many hours inside a shelter while darkness stretches across the frozen landscape outside. There are no electric lights, phones, television, or internet, so the fire becomes the center of the room. People gather around it, talk, tell stories, teach children, remember the past, and create meaning. Anthropological research on traditional societies shows that firelight can transform social behavior. Daytime conversations often focus on food, work, plans, problems, and other practical matters. Nighttime conversations around fires can shift toward stories, myths, ancestors, spirits, adventures, history, and the meaning of life. The fire, therefore, becomes more than a source of heat, it becomes a social technology. It creates a place where knowledge can be transferred, children can learn, memories can survive, and groups can become communities. Perhaps one of the most important technologies humans ever developed was simply learning how to survive together. One person might know where to find fuel, while another knew how to stitch clothing, and another understood how to construct the walls. Someone else might know where food could be stored or which materials worked best. Knowledge became distributed throughout the group rather than depending on a single person. When one person died, others could carry pieces of that knowledge forward. That is how a complex survival system could continue for thousands of years without a written manual. Eventually, these systems produced something even more remarkable: culture. Ice Age figurines, artwork, symbols, and stories were created by people living through some of the harshest conditions our species ever experienced. They were not simply trying to stay alive, they were thinking about animals, people, identity, death, beauty, and meaning. The cold did not destroy human culture and may have made shared culture even more important. When the outside world is dangerous, the shelter becomes the center of social life, and the fire becomes a gathering point. Long winter nights create time for stories that can carry knowledge from one generation to the next. The same fire that cooks food can teach a child how to survive. The same person telling a story can pass down a warning about dangerous terrain. The same shelter protecting the body can also protect memory. And that makes the story much bigger than winter. Eventually, the climate changed and the world became warmer. Forests returned to areas that had once been open steppe, creating new environments and new ways of living. Some specialized Ice Age technologies became less necessary as the climate changed.
And when a technology is no longer necessary, the knowledge behind it can disappear. It doesn't have to disappear because it was wrong or because people became less intelligent. It can simply disappear because nobody needs to remember it anymore. The extreme cold shelters faded from use, specialized fuel systems disappeared, and clothing traditions changed. Generations passed, and thousands of years later, archaeologists began digging into the ground. They found bones, pits, hearths, tools, and the remains of shelters. Piece by piece, those discoveries revealed a completely different picture of Ice Age humans. They were not helpless victims of the environment, but engineers working without modern engineering. They understood materials through experience, heat through observation, airflow through experimentation, and storage through necessity. They understood insulation, seasonal planning, fuel management, food preservation, and the importance of cooperation. Most importantly, they understood that survival was a system rather than a single invention. The shelter slowed heat loss, while the fire added heat and ventilation controlled the air. Clothing protected the body, while fuel kept the fire burning and food stores prevented starvation. The group itself preserved the knowledge that allowed every other part of the system to work. That is why the word primitive can be so misleading. These people lacked modern technology, but they did not lack intelligence. Their tools were simple because the materials available to them were simple. Their environment was difficult, their problems were enormous, and they solved those problems with what they had. Now go back to that little plastic thermostat on your wall. The number displayed there represents a level of comfort that your ancestors could achieve only through extraordinary effort. For us, warmth is automatic. A thermostat clicks, a heater turns on, and we barely notice. For Ice Age humans, warmth had to be earned through planning, labor, fuel, food repairs, knowledge, and cooperation. A warm night could represent months of preparation, and sometimes years of accumulated knowledge.
The people who paid that price were separated from you by tens of thousands of years, yet you are still living inside the consequences of what they learned. You inherited the idea that walls can protect you, layers can trap heat, ventilation matters, clothing can be engineered, food can be stored, and fire can become the center of a home. You also inherited something even more important, the ability to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Comfort feels normal because you were born into it, but it is the result of an incredibly long chain of human problem solving. That chain began when our ancestors looked at a frozen world and refused to accept that the cold had the final word. They didn't have factories, electricity, or modern science. They had observation, memory, cooperation, and the ability to learn from failure. So tonight, when the heating turns on and you barely notice it, remember what warmth once meant. Remember people sitting beside a small fire inside a shelter made from bone and hide while a frozen landscape surrounded them. Remember that every part of their environment was trying to take heat away from them, yet they still found a way to stay warm. They didn't conquer winter by becoming stronger than the cold. They conquered it by becoming smarter than the problem. And that may be the most important survival lesson they left us. Human beings have never been the strongest animals, fastest animals, or animals with the thickest fur and sharpest claws. What we have is the ability to take one generation's solution and give it to the next. Then we improve it again, and continue the process until a small fire becomes a heating system, an animal hide becomes a technical jacket, a hole in the ground becomes insulation, a shelter becomes a house, and survival becomes comfort. The warmth around you today is not just technology, it is history. It is the accumulated memory of people who lived in a world where staying warm was never guaranteed. They looked at the cold, studied it, adapted to it, and eventually built a life inside it. They started with almost nothing: earth, bone, hide, fire, and the stubborn refusal to give up. And somehow, thousands of generations later, that refusal is still keeping you warm. But there is one final question. If Ice Age humans became this good at defeating the cold, what was left for them to fear? Freezing wasn't the only danger waiting outside those shelters. Something else moved through the darkness. Something thicker walls could not simply block. Something could follow them, hunt them, and wait just beyond the edge of the firelight. And once you understand what that threat was, the entire story of Ice Age survival becomes even darker. That story is waiting for you on screen.